Thank you, Weiping, for these warm words, and thank you, Father Ha, for your invitation. Yep. And it's a pleasure for me to talk to this audience and to feel, well, at home here, and to introduce you today to the last recent evolutions of my ongoing research. Because every year I can come and tell a story with a new chapter. Because welcome, because it is ongoing research, and this year, all in all, I would have spent 4 months in China. So that gives you the scale of the work, which is progressing fast, but it's also generating new research questions. Yeah. And so today I will talk about the issue of the heritagization, and I will explain you what this terrible word means. And in fact, we can start with this question: why are some buildings and sites considered as heritage and other not? This is a basic question. Some buildings, they wear this kind of signs, explaining that they are listed, that they are considered officially as being heritage, and that they receive money from authorities for their maintenance, and why are other buildings not? Well, this is the result of a process, and that process is called today the process of heritagization. It's a difficult word. It's a translation from a word from the French, la patrimonialisation, and the idea is to have the dynamic of a movement, because it is a process that is never finished. It is an ongoing process. It's a dynamic process whereby a relic that is not heritage gradually becomes heritage. So it's a kind of change of status. And this process is based on the awareness of heritage values. But these values, they are changing. Every generation is looking with other eyes to the past, with other questions to the past, with other interests, and also discover other values in relics from the past. That is why that movement is so dynamic. Because we are conditioned by our present context, and also relics and buildings, as we will see, their uses are also changing, and this is why the whole heritage sector is a sector in constant moving, and when something becomes heritage, it is never for the eternity. So it has always to be questioned, and new generations would have interest for things that the previous was completely neglecting. That's evolution. So, because the whole concept of heritage is based on values, we can ask other questions. Which values? And these values are changing. But also, who is deciding? Who is looking to these values and defining the values? What are the criteria to define values? And when does this happen? And in fact, you have two different movements. You have an informal movement, which we can also call a bottom-up movement, which is the decision of people who find that heritage is important and meaningful for them. So it is their own heritage. While you have another movement, which is top-down, which is more formal, and where these values are officialized by a legal protection from a state authority. It's a kind of public interest, and then a building is officially listed or graded and protected by a law. But of course, there is a lot of heritage that is not protected, but is heritage for many people. So these are these two approaches, which in fact are not opposed, but they can come together, or they can also emerge in certain cases, as we will see. So the crucial moment about heritage is often the moment when we lose something. It is when we lose something that we realize that what we have lost was valuable. That is a process. And so we know that with people. When we lose someone of our family, it is always a dramatic moment. But there is before and after the death. And from the moment of a person dies, well, you have a process of mourning, and memory is selecting things from the past, and is selecting good or less good souvenirs, and will build different stories around that. And when you will tell to your children about your parents or your grandparents, well, you will tell a story that is different because you have a generation and time is going over that. And that is why also people need places of memory. Cemeteries are places of memory. But as we know, memory is also fading with time. And that is what we call a second death. We will all die twice. The first one is a physical death, and the second one is one nobody will think anymore to you. Well, your memory will be completely eradicated. And that takes several generations. Only pharaohs who build that kind of tombs for the eternity, they never die a second time, so they consider themselves as more or less as God. But the time is running, memory is fading, and then it's work of historians or work of archaeologists who are digging and rediscovering things. Well, in fact, this process is comparable for buildings and for other kinds of heritage. It is at the moment when we lost something that we realize that we lose something valuable. And it is in the context of the French Revolution, which is a moment of massive destruction, that the first ideas of modern heritage care find their origin. It is in the context of massive destruction of churches, of tombs. And you see there destruction of the tombs of the kings of France in Saint-Denis. The kings of France were a symbol, so their memory had to be eradicated. It's like the pyramid of the pharaoh you just have seen. And it is in this context that very important concepts linked with memory and heritage, they find their origin. So the concept of vandalism, that's a word that we all use. Well, it's at that time that it was used for the first time. Also the idea of collective heritage. That in fact this building, this church, was not belonging to a specific religious order, but because it was a good piece of architecture, it belonged to the whole society as a kind of, as the heritage of the collectivity, of the whole society. And a third concept is the concept of public utility. So it's a difference between something that is belonging to someone particular, which is private, and here, when it's art or heritage, it belongs to everybody and is util for the whole society. And there is a shift from something private to public interest, and that is the shift of the movement of heritagization, from something private to public interest. And all these concepts has been defined by a religious, l'Abbé Grégoire, who was a priest, who was a member of the first parliament in Paris. And Abbé Grégoire is a very important man. You will Google when you will be home, because he's the only priest buried in the Panthéon in Paris, not because he was at the origin of the first law on heritage, but because he's at the origin of the first law against slave trade. So it's a very modern man, very important man, and he was, as I just said, at the origin of the first law, 1793, first protection law of heritage. And so, you see there to the right, a man in a kind of dramatic picture, romantic, dramatic lithograph, in that church in Saint-Denis, where people are destroying the tombs of the kings, and the man tries to stop that violence, not with a weapon, but with a law. You see, he has the law in his hand. And he says, stop, you are not a law to do that. And what he tries to say is that these are not the tombs of the kings of France, but this is art. This is art that is belonging to the whole society. And that is that shift from the private to the public. You will understand why I explained this as an introduction. And so in the history, similar moments of massive destruction and generating a reaction and awareness of value of what we are losing, well, that happened often in history. So these are other examples. One from Europe, the 50s and the 60s, big period of economical development, and all these old things and buildings, etc., they were considered as being obstacles to progress. And many things were demolished. So you see here a house of Victor Horta that today would be World Heritage, but it was turned down in the late 50s, and a big skyscraper was built on the same place. Well, in Brussels at that time you had that world exhibition, and you see these are a typical icon of that time, with the car, with these images of progress. And past, or relics from the past, were considered as obstacles to progress. And now I'm jumping to China today, where the situation is in many cases more or less similar, with this big boom of the development. Well, often old buildings, not the top, of course, because they are protected, but many other buildings are considered as obstacles to progress, or turned down. So, to conclude this introduction about the theoretical side, well, within that heritageization movement that is a perpetual ongoing process, well, in fact, knowledge plays a very important role. Because knowledge is used for making heritage value assessment, defining the values, and we have seen that the values define the level of heritage. So this is based on knowledge. But these heritage value assessment, they will also raise heritage awareness. And when there is heritage awareness, you will have new research questions. And new research, further research, and developing new knowledge. This is a little bit the situation in where I'm finding myself, starting this research on churches in China 4 or 5 years ago. And after 5 years, well, I realized that knowledge really, and we will see what kind of knowledge, is essential in this process, and that it generates new questions, and that things are going very fast, because there is interest. And so knowledge can be very diverse. Right? It could be architecture, historical context, spatial context, construction, use and transformation, the use by different generations. And heritage is also very diverse, because the notion of heritage is also changing. As you can see, there is the immovable heritage. These are the buildings and the sites. But you have the movable heritage, which is furniture. And you also have the intangible heritage, which is becoming more and more important. And this is about the people, but also about the rituals that people perform in buildings, or craftsmanship, or old traditions, or songs, and also beliefs. This is all part of intangible heritage. And all these things together, well, generate a changing perception. Things are changing. New questions, new perception. So, after this introduction about that word heritageization, now we understand what I mean by using this word. This is the structure of this lecture this evening in 4 parts. The first one is about early modern churches in China. What are we talking about? So I will give you a brief introduction of what it is and its evolution. Then the second point will be the threads and uses. Is this heritage, or are these churches threatened or not, and how. And then the third and the fourth part are focusing on heritagization. First, protection and restoration, because when something is protected, well, it will be renovated or restored. And the fourth part is about knowledge. You have seen how important knowledge is, and this changing perception which result from the development of knowledge. So, early modern churches in China. I just start with these three buildings, which are perhaps the three oldest churches in China. Everybody says it's Macau. That's not true. The oldest church is in Shanghai. It's Laodang. Nobody knows that, or it's less known. It's in a school complex today. It's no more used as a church. And in fact, it's very complementary to the Church of Macau, which was built new by Jesuits, while Laodang is an old hall from the Ming Dynasty that has been given to Jesuits, who transformed it into a church. So it's a building that is in transversal, and then they added this first little entrance later, so that is Qing, but the main hall is still from the Ming Dynasty. But I'm not talking about this, but I'm talking about these early modern churches, and these are the buildings from the 19th century, or the second half of the 19th century, up to the 1940s. That is the great time of the modern mission to China, Catholic and Christian, so very important. And during that time, well, thousands of buildings, churches, but also schools and parish houses and orphanages were built all over China. And these buildings, they were built by Chinese, but they often were designed by Westerners, or they were built together. So in various styles. So there were discussions about the choice of a style. Would it be a local style, or a Western, or a hybrid? And this wide range of building types and forms, they are expressing the complex identities of Christianity in China. Christianity in China is a very, as you know, a very complex matter, with and architecture is expressing that complexity in, as we will see, many different forms and types of buildings. And there is a general evolution. We will see the three steps from a kind of Western colonial mission field, typical 19th century in the industrial world, with missionaries coming from specific Western countries and trying to transpose a model to another side of the world, not only China, because the same process is happening in Africa and other continents, and then a last step in the 1920s and 30s with the origin of a real Chinese church and inculturation or indigenization. So the first step in the 19th century of these early modern churches are these models that we could that are still related with models from the colony going back to the 16th and the 17th century. So this architect from Macau, or even the church in Shanghai, Dongjiadu, could be in the Philippines or could be in South America. So they are really belonging to a kind of colonial universal style. And this will evolve. Sometimes will mix with local elements. The Cathedral of Xi'an is a very interesting case with a Renaissance, very classic design, well proportioned, but mixed with Chinese elements. So you have here this kind of Chinese screen behind this triumphal arch. This is a beautiful composition by Franciscan, Italian Franciscans. But the first Gothic church, which is a totally different model, was, as you know, built in Guangzhou. The Cathedral of Guangzhou. It's a long works from 1863 to 1888. There are a lot of stories around this cathedral. I will not tell these stories now because that is not the purpose of this lecture. I think I already done it in a previous one. But it was the introduction of a style that was totally unknown in China, except perhaps the Anglican Cathedral St. John in Hong Kong is older. but in a real colonial context, because here the context is very different. And this building is a full stone building that, that implied that local workers, they had to learn to carve stone and to build such an ashlar building, which is very complex, and using also new forms that they didn't know, like these pointed arches, all this Gothic vocabulary of tracery, windows, or flying buttresses, pinnacles, gargoyles. They are all things that were completely foreign. So design came from the West, but it was realized by Chinese, and they found stone carvers in the Yunnan province who came to Guangzhou, and the stone was coming from Hong Kong. So it was really a very important place, a long work, and also a contest, because many people in Guangzhou were not happy to see this built in the center of their city, because the city already had been largely destroyed by the French and the British troops. But on this old picture, there on top, you see the cathedral on the top line to the left, that volume on the skyline that is completely emerging from a city that was low-rise at that time. And, well, many Cantonese, they were thinking that this would change the feng shui of the city. But in the treaty ports, you have churches built in styles of the different countries, British Gothic, or German Romanesque, or French Gothic, or Russian Orthodox. You have these complex combinations of styles expressing different religions and different identities, national identities. So German, Lutheran, Anglican, British, Orthodox, Russian, French Catholic, but you also could have English Catholic, which is then another kind of Gothic. So you have a kind of encyclopedia of styles from the past that are realized or implemented here in China by missionaries coming from different countries with different backgrounds and different identities. And the Chinese, of course, they only see that this is not Chinese, that this is foreign. But that complexity is obvious for the people who are building these churches. And that is why, perhaps, they promoted it. But here we are in the treaty ports, and in the treaty ports, these churches, of course, they had to compete against each other, and they were also, in first instance, built for Westerners. More interesting are the churches that are not in the treaty ports, but that were built in a rural area, in deep mainland China, we would say today, even though mainland China is less deep today than in the past. So very remote places, places where construction and architecture was the same and long tradition since more than 1,000 or perhaps 2,000 years. And here suddenly a missionary came with new ideas, with new forms, with new well, construction techniques in the best cases. But he could not realize it because the people had to learn. And so this would generate, of this encounter, would generate a generation of architecture, of buildings, that we could call hybrid buildings, which are not 100% Chinese style and not 100% Western style. They are the result of a work together. And this generates a wide range of very fascinating buildings. Many of them are no more existing, but are known thanks to images. I will explain later why they are no more existing. But you see from these images here that they are very different. Some look like a house with 5 bays, 5 zen, but you see it's a church because it's written on above the door, but also because you have a cross on top. But if you look, there are also pinnacles, which are Gothic elements on the roof. This is a church under construction, which is absolutely a Chinese wooden structure, a timber structure. But this one looks Chinese, perhaps because it's red, but in fact it is not. You have a system of iron ties and tie beams and iron tie rods, which was not used in Chinese wooden structures. And you have a big diversity of such buildings. These are other examples from other areas, from Guizhou in the three images above, using local craftsmen for decoration and for color. And this is the Cathedral of Guiyang is absolutely fascinating, combining a pagoda on top of the apse of the choir. And the apse of the choir has Gothic windows. So this is a very, very interesting combination. Or this one, which is like a Chinese house with 5 gen, but with tracery Gothic windows, etc. That is that first generation of hybrid buildings that we also can call acculturated buildings. So that is how missionaries, they really integrated the local culture, and they developed, together with local people, architecture that was deeply Chinese. A next step happened after 1900. 1900 is a very important moment in the history of the church in China, because it's the year of the Boxer Uprising, which is starting in 99 and ending in 1901, but let's say it's around 1900. And at that time, well, many Christians were persecuted and massacred, missionaries too, but also many churches were destroyed. Because people, they can run away, but churches can't. So that is why then they are burned, or they are destroyed. And these wooden churches, they are easy to burn. So all these buildings, many of these buildings, were destroyed. But because of the Boxer Protocol after the uprising in 1901, well, in the Boxer Protocol, well, the emperor and China were obliged to pay indemnity to the missionaries and also to the countries that had lost buildings and people. And that is why after 1900 there was a lot of money available for rebuilding churches, and the church at that time was in a situation where they really could build fully Western buildings. They didn't need to discuss with local people, but they could build cathedrals like this one. You have here some examples that are fully Western and that could in fact be well, in Europe. So there are some Chinese elements, of course, but they are not in the construction and in the decoration, but more in the material and the result of the fact that Chinese workers realized these buildings. But they are less Chinese than the buildings of the first phase. This is really a kind of very imperialist generation of buildings that are expressing a victory, that are expressing domination of after a victory. And it's also in that context that you had the famous craft workshop of Shanghai, Tusanwan or Tusewei, which was an orphanage where many Gothic elements and Gothic decoration was produced and spread over China, stained glass windows, paintings, furniture, etc. This is another example. We studied these churches, and especially this architect, who was a Belgian architect from the Schroedvader, and he had been trained as an architect in Belgium, so he was really skilled. He could design complex things, and he designed here in Mongolia and in the north of Hebei province, well, buildings that we could find in Belgium and in Flanders and in Europe. So he really transposed a model to the other side of the world because he was convinced that Gothic was the universal style of the Catholic Church and was the only convenient style for church buildings. That movement evolved a little bit after 1911, 1912, the birth of the Republic, a new anti-foreign movement, and well, it evolved. It evolved in another direction. No more 100% Gothic buildings, but buildings which were more influenced by Romanesque architecture, as the examples you see here, and perhaps the Shoshan Basilica in Shanghai, also designed by the same Belgian architect, Father de Moerloos, is perhaps the most symbolic of this series of buildings. You see this is built very late, 1922, 1936. This is absolutely the Mingo time. And we will see that it was totally anachronistic because at the same time there was already another movement ongoing. And that other movement is the third phase of my evolution, which is the development of a Sino-Christian style, which is the will of Rome, and that is part of the new policy implemented by Pope Benedict XV in 1919, in the famous encyclical letter Maximum Illud, that is promoting inculturation, that is promoting the development of local churches with a local priest using local language and also having local bishops, and asking the missionaries no more to be in service of their native countries or their home countries or the interests of their home countries, but to be in service of the native population. And Rome sent to China Archbishop Celso Costantini, that certainly a name most of you know, and he was the apostolic delegate to China from 1922 to 1933, and he was commissioned by the Pope to implement that new inculturation movement. And Costantini was also very interested in art. He was an artist himself, he was a sculptor. And as soon arrived to China, he also tried to promote indigenous Christian art. And his first reference text is a letter he wrote on 23rd of April 23. He wrote this letter to two bishops of Maryknoll order, and it's entitled "The Need of Developing a Sino-Christian Architecture for Our Catholic Missions." So he really was against Gothic, he really was against the Western styles, and he said, well, Chinese priests should be educated in seminaries, the architecture of which should be Chinese. And so he didn't found a Catholic Chinese architect in China, that didn't exist at that time, and so he asked a Benedictine monk to come to China and to create that Sino-Christian style. That is Father Adalbert Gresnich, this is one of his buildings, who stayed in China during 4 years. That is the topic of my next book. And designed important buildings which are not churches but are buildings for education, seminaries. So this is the first, this is a seminary and convent of the Disciples of the Lord, which is the first Chinese, fully Chinese religious congregation, society. But his masterpiece is in Beijing. It was a Catholic University of Beijing, Fuzhen Dashi, that today is used by Peking Normal University. And this was designed in 1929-1930, which is, well, referring to Chinese elements, especially to, you know, these bell and drum towers. That is the style he's referring to. But this architecture is also modern. It's fully reinforced concrete structure. And this is a modern architecture that should be functional for a university educating a new Chinese and Christian, but not exclusively Catholic elite. And of course, you know this building, also designed by the same architect in Aberdeen, today Holy Spirit Seminary, but this building was designed to become the regional seminary of South China. So this was for seminarists from Guangdong, from Guangxi, from Yunnan, from all these, even from Fujian, from the south, who could be educated in this building complex. Only one wing has been built, but the other, we have the design. And if you are more interested on this, well, you can read an article about this in the last issue of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, Hong Kong branch, that has been published a couple of weeks ago. Not only Catholics developed that Sino-Christian style, so that movement of inculturation, other Christians, Anglicans, Methodists, or here Lutherans, Tao Fengshan. These are places you know in Hong Kong. But this is from the 1930s, while, as the article proves, this building is the very first in Hong Kong to be built in this modern Chinese style, which was not the style promoted by the colony, while in China at that time many buildings were already built in this style. Anyway, that is the evolution, and the last step of this evolution before 1940 or 1937, 38, depending on the area, is this kind of buildings which are still, the three on the top, which are still referring to some Gothic forms. You look to the windows and the traceries and the towers and the crenellation, but are reinforced concrete buildings clad with brick and stone, and referring to models from the United States or from models from Germany. So this is a kind of modern Gothic, which is no more the Gothic from after the Boxer uprising, but referring to other models and coming not directly from Europe, but from the United States and promoted by Anglicans and other Protestants. While at the same moment, in some urban contexts, architects were developing really fully modern architecture, and this is rather exceptional. I only know of 4 or 5 churches, fully reinforced concrete churches built in China before the war. While in Europe at that time, many of such churches were built. In Hong Kong, they would be built after the war. But this is before the war, a project of a church not realized in Shanghai. That is another one, fully concrete church built in Shanghai. So this is not inculturated at all. This is just modern, and modern architecture is another kind of universal architecture. So that's an evolution from the universal Gothic paradigma to a universal modern paradigma, and then you have a local Chinese and modern, and that shows the complexity of these 1920s and 1930s, which is a fascinating period of the history of China, because China is totally open to the world and open to influences, and also creating a new identity in the context of, all these new movements going from the Minguo, the Kuomintang, but also the communism and other new ideologies developing on this continent country. But everything stops with the war, and China will, as we will see, will change completely after the 1940s. So the last question is, how many of these churches has been built? This is a question I always face. People want to know how many churches there were in China, and then immediately they ask, and how many are surviving today? Well, I can't answer both questions. But this is a map of Catholic China in 1933. That is after the map has been redrawn. There were new dioceses created. And you see you have archdioceses. These are the black lines. And then in the different patches, the different colors, there are dioceses. And dioceses in mission fields, they are called apostolic vicariates or vicariates apostolics. So you see there are a lot. And in each vicariate apostolic, you have a bishop of an apostolic vicar. And most of them, they belong to different missionary orders. And so a province I'm doing field work now, this is a Leuven University and Tsinghua University research project, is in the province of Anhui. You see on the dot there, on the arrow. And the province of Anhui at the origin was, together with Jiangsu, was one big diocese with Nanjing at center. And then because the number of Christians grew, it was divided in several dioceses. And what is presently Anhui was divided in 3 Jesuit dioceses, Bengbu, Anqing, and Wuhu. And this is here the map of Anqing. Anqing is I don't have a pointer, but it's the purple square, that is Anqing on the Yangtze River. And then you see that the territory is divided in smaller parts with these red lines surrounded by red, and in the middle of which you always have a red dot. So these are sections. And the red dot is an important church with several priests. And in one section, you have different parishes. And the parishes are the blue dots. They are smaller churches with one priest. And then all the small crosses, and you see this is a detailed map of the 3 sections, bottom to the right. Well, all the small crosses are Christian villages. So these are places where you have a chapel, but no priest. And the priest is coming from that parish and is visiting these places 2 or 3 times a year. And he's staying there for a week. He's giving the sacraments, and he's controlling if things are well. And that was the organization. A kind of pyramid organization with the bishop, and then the important sections, and the parishes, and then what they call the stations, or the Christian village, or the Christianities. And in all these places, well, you find churches or chapels. Because even here, you expect to find a small chapel. Or at least one building with 3 rooms, one for the priest when he comes, and one for the chapel, and then a small room for a sacristy, or for just a room that can be used for talking or just for education. And also in these places, well, in the main one you had a seminary, because each diocese has a seminary. And then in the smaller one you have schools and orphanages, and then at local level, well, you can have a very small local church with 1 or 2 virgins taking care of local population. So it is very difficult to work on these maps, to identify these places. The blue dots, no problem, but the small blue crosses, that is very, very hard to identify these places. And most of these chapels, they are just gone. This is one that I visited 3 weeks ago. In the north of Anhui, this is close to Wuhe, not far away from Bengbu. That's an area where all the churches have been destroyed, and all these rural churches have been demolished, except this one. That's the only one. And that is because the local village, and this is a very small village in the middle of the rice fields. It's a village on one street, which is on a ditch, higher, because the rice fields are water. In the city of Wuhe, as its name says, there are 5 rivers, so it's really a flood area. And the village is just built on a street, and this is the church. And here, really, the people of the village, they fought for the church. And that is why this church survived the Cultural Revolution. And this church is not protected, but just the local people love this church. And the priest is visiting this place 3 times a year, in the middle of the rice fields. So it is still in good condition, even though you see the wet in the walls. That's not that good. But inside, the wooden structure is fine. And I had found an old picture in the archives, and so I was very moved to see that building today. And the local people were so moved to see for the first time the old picture that I, of course, gave them. And so that is why we worked together. And it was a very hot day, 36 degrees, but we made the measurement of this nice place. But this introduced me to that bottom-up movement. Because, of course, when we talk about churches in China, and so I can come to my second point, the threats and the uses. When we talk about churches in China, we all are thinking about the Cultural Revolution. And perhaps now you understand why I was starting this talk with the French Revolution. Because it's the same. It's a revolution, you turn everything upside down for having a new start. And so you demolish symbols because you want to start something new. So this is exactly the same as the engraving we have seen with demolishing the tombs of the kings in France. So this is one of the exceptional pictures taken during such a demolition of a church interior. It's very exceptional to have documentation, to find information about this. Impossible to have statistics. But this picture has been taken in This is wrong. It's 66. Sorry, this is a mistake. In 1966, I should correct it immediately. It's 1966. You've seen it. Beg your pardon. But you see here that that Chairman Mao has taken the place of Christ on the tympanon. So this is absolutely correct. And in the Romanesque architecture, and that all the stuff have been brought out of the church. You see an altar here, and has been burned on the public space. That is why today, finding in China original interior, original furniture, or organs, as you know, this is very, very, very exceptional. There are things, but most have been destroyed, stained glass windows, paintings, etc., and altars. But so when we are talking about destructions in China, we usually think to this. Because it's recent and it was very dramatic, and it was not only against churches. Many Buddhist temples and other valuable heritage was turned down in these contexts. But in the 1950s, after the expulsion of the foreign missionaries out of China, well, these foreign-led churches were replaced by government-approved institutions. The Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association for the Catholics, and the Free Self-Patriotic Movement for Christians. And in the early 80s, or from the early 80s, the church buildings that had survived the Cultural Revolution and all the destruction movements, they were returned to the official sanctioned churches under the supervision of the state administration for religious affairs, which is still the case today. So the underground churches, they never received all churches back because they're underground. So all the old buildings, they were given back to the official church because this is linked with property and with also, it's not land property, but property of buildings. So what I want to look at now in this second section is what happened between 1950s and today. And the history of the church and churches in China is a long history of destructions and of clashes. Not only the Cultural Revolution, but it starts with the Taipings in the 1850s and 60s, and then you have the famous Tianjin massacre in 1870s, the Boxer uprising, and then also destroying of Christian villages by the communists from the late 1920s and in the 1930s. So these are all movements that are focusing on people, but also on buildings and architecture, because architecture is expressing an identity in the public space. That is a way of expressing your disagreement with a movement or with a religion or with ideology, is to attack its building. But also, many buildings were demolished during the Sino-Japanese War and also during the Civil War. And it's hard to know who destroyed these buildings. We have no statistics about this. Sometimes in missionary journals like here, well, you have some dramatic pictures. But during the Civil War, we have very little documentation about destructions. And it's even Kuomintang destroyed churches and bombed churches. And, it was really a dramatic time. So that large heritage already was for a part threatened long before the Cultural Revolution. That is what I want to point out. And the Cultural Revolution also reused a lot of buildings. Because destroying a building is a kind of, it's a behavior that you express that you don't need a building, that you are rich or that you are wealthy enough to turn down something. But often, buildings were just reused. The symbol of the building were turned down. You see the spire of towers turned down, so the church is no more visible in the skyline. Often towers were turned down, but buildings themselves, they were just reused. So this is the famous Anglican Cathedral of Shanghai, designed by Gilbert Scott, William Gilbert Scott, famous British architect who sent his plans to Shanghai. And you see on the section how this church was reused. It was used as a cinema at the ground floor, and then they built a concrete floor in the middle, and above you had housing with rooms. So these are the cinema here inside, and here a corridor with the rooms. and the church tower without its spire, and, well, really a transformation, we would say adaptive reuse. This is what's happening in many churches in Europe today. No cultural revolution, but it's just a question of use of buildings. And in the context of the Cultural Revolution, well, many churches receive other use. And thanks to that other use, well, they are still existing today. So you can turn the story on a way, and today they are heritageized. Today they are considered heritage. Here they are not considered heritage. They are just considered a shelter that you could use functionally. But they will be heritageized later. This is another example I visited a couple of years ago in Huhoto in Mongolia, where you have the chapel of the seminary of Huhoto that is still used as a factory. But that happened on many places. These are very recent visits of this year during the fieldwork in Anhui. Well, some churches are just used as storage rooms. Other are ruins. Only the two towers are staying, but the church has been destroyed. But in both cases, they are belonging to the church. They have been given back to the church, but the church has no need for these buildings. So they just rent it. So this is a source of income. The building is belonging to the parish or to the diocese and has a use. That's better than turning it down and selling the land. But they are not yet heritage. That is what I mean. More dramatic is the other phenomenon that is happening today in China is the rural exodus. As you know, there are tens of thousands of villages that are empty today in China because people move to cities. And these villages, well, they are abandoned. This is one of these villages, Bijiaqiao. These are the two pictures I found in the archives of the Jesuits in France, where you see the village with the river and the church. This is an inner view of the church, but the inner view of the church today is like this. Because there is no more village. And this is still owned by the church, but the church has no more use. And again, when a building has no use, and this is true for churches, but for every building, well, it becomes a ruin, because nobody will pay for its maintenance. So here, the bishop decided to remove the wooden structure, just to protect it, because he knew that if the wooden structure would remain in the church, it would be stolen by people. So this is a picture the local administration was able to give me, a picture of the interior of the church 10 years ago. It was empty, no use, but still, you see part of the roof already gone, but still the whole wooden structure there, and the carved stones base is still there. Now it is moved, and nobody knows where it is. And the heritage people, the local heritage people, they don't know where it is, and this church is not listed. But a little bit further, there is a Buddhist temple, which is also a ruin, because the whole village is a ruin. This is another example in Mongolia. It's a totally different area. This was the church of the Scout Fathers, too. Well, this is the present situation. When we went to that village, we had to wait 1 hour to find the key. And when we found the key and when we entered, suddenly all the people of the village, they came to enter the church with us, because that church was closed. And then we met the priest, who was absolutely not happy that we visited the church, because he wanted the church to collapse, so he could build a new one and get money from elsewhere and build a new one. And the local people, they looked sad. That was the first image of my PowerPoint. They look sad because this is their church. It's not the dream of the priest that is his future church, but this is the church in the middle of the village. So these are phenomena too, and that is that process of heritageization. Local people feeling this is their heritage, but you know in China, bottom-up movements, they are not welcome. This is not like in Hong Kong, I mean. They all had a meaning, so they all had something to tell us. But I don't know if this church is still standing. This was 4 years ago. What's happening too is that churches that survived the Cultural Revolution, this is another one in Mongolia, Yangchung, you see that the tower has been turned down. The tower is gone. And now it has been given back to the church. and they are restoring this building. They are doing that with enthusiasm, but with not very great competence, not very professionally, because they just want to have a church looking new and clean. So you see here they are cladding the walls with plastic marble imitation. So they are packing all the wet inside the wall, which is excellent. And they are painting it. And so they will have a nice house of God, which is new and which looks new and clean. But they don't receive support by the local authorities of heritage because, well, as long as they don't receive money from heritage, well, they don't want to receive advice of heritage. So this is a wrong system. But this is also the result of the lack of collaboration between the state administration for cultural heritage in China and the Bureau of Religious Affairs. These are two administrations that are not working together. They have other interests. And that is not good for heritage. Or, yeah, these are archive pictures. You see here the dates. This is Guangxi, 1981, 1996. Well, when I see this, I never will think that this is an old church. But it is an old church. And of course, the churches that were restituted to the communities were in very, very bad state. Because they had been reused, they had not been maintained during a half a century. They had been, you see, this is really in very poor state. Well, the rich communities, they turned the church down and they built a new one with reinforced concrete, big towers, and showing the renaissance of the church. But the poor communities, they did this. So in fact, for economical reason, they had a better respect of heritage. But which was not really because it was heritage, but because of economic reason. And as soon they have more money, well, they turn this down and they build bigger churches. You know these phenomenons in Shanxi, in Hebei, in Fujian. There are areas where many new and big churches are built. So no question of heritage. And this is a place I was in Anhui also a couple of weeks ago in the north. These are two new churches. To the left, one built in 1994, and now it's too small, and they built a new one, 2015, there to the right. It's twice the size of the other one. This is again a very poor village where the priest is coming 3 or 4 times a year, and they just need a place for the community. This is their own heritage. So who are we to say this is nice or ugly? This is just to be respected, it's a house of God, and it's built by people. But when I'm not happy is when I see this. This is a tomb of a French Jesuit who died in 1911. And they're not interested to restore it or to put it in the new church. They say, no, it's broken and it's dirty. But I said, no, but it's perhaps the history of this place. And you see, there are different point of views. And there you realize that your point of view, well, perhaps is not always right, or you have to first listen to their point of view and why they are not interested in this past. You see, there is water, and it's completely abandoned in a corner of the compound. But so perhaps the fact that I was interested in it, and so we rubbed the stone and we took pictures and we measured the stone, well, perhaps they would say, oh, this interests a guy coming from the other side of the world. So perhaps it's interesting. Perhaps you can sell it, I don't know. But so, trade and uses. You have the villages that are emptying, but you also have the trade and uses in urban context. Urbanization is also a huge phenomenon in China. Many of these places I visit, and I think they are villages. They are big towns today of several hundred thousand people. And in that context, well, these old small churches, when they survive, they are often very marginalized. So this is Xuancheng. This is a town south of Wuhu in Anhui province. You see there the old church, but it is surrounded in an environment where the church is no more dominating small wooden houses of one floor. Now it's completely dominated from very high-rise buildings. So I climbed here in a tower, and from the roof we took that picture. And you see that the community tried to be present on the public space. They built a new concrete tower very recently, so in order to be visible from this main boulevard, which is a kind of urban motorway as you have in all the cities now. So it's a kind of marginalization in a city while you are still standing on the same place. Or then more dramatic is when you have a motorway here. This is a flyover. This is in Shanghai. This is the site of the French University, of Aurora University. That was the French Catholic University of the Jesuits in Shanghai. And, well, they had a church, a brilliant church from the 1930s, built with reinforced concrete. But because the road was enlarged, the church has to be moved 30 meters away. So they destroyed completely the building and they rebuilt it, more or less the same shape. You see the tower there, but it's a building of 5 floors. So they could speculate on square meters. So it was a very good thing for them, but not a good thing for heritage. And threatened use as well, this is happening too. You still could have some accidents. This was 2 years ago in Ningpo when the cathedral was burned during a storm. So now I switch to the second one because my PowerPoints were too heavy. And so we can reach the third part of this lecture about heritagization, protection and restoration. I think now you have, on the one hand, the overview about more or less what that means, churches in China, the complexity, the diversity of styles, of sizes, of locations, context, origins, etc. And otherwise, also an overview of the threats or what happened with these churches and also about the uses, different uses and reuses. So, the paradox of this difficult heritagization process in China, of Christian heritage in China, and its multiple layered cultural and historical meaning, as we have seen, from identity bearers of local community to international shared built heritage. So today we can approach it from very, very, very different point of views. It is local heritage of local community, but we also could say this is shared built heritage when it's designed by a Westerner, built in China. So is it Chinese, is it Westerner? Well, it's both, of course, and it's shared. So there is a common past, there is a common history that could be used as a dynamic element for the future, as we will see. But a question is, why only cathedrals and major urban churches are protected today in China? These small churches, they are not. And they are of course threatened. And why do many reviving Christian communities neglect or demolish their own churches and build new ones? Much larger, but generally referring to Western styles. We also could find it, amazing that many of the new churches built in China, they are Gothic, or they are referring to Gothic forms, even though they are in reinforced concrete. I call them postmodern Gothic. That's why I don't show them here. They are not early modern, they are postmodern Gothic. So we have early modern Gothic, and postmodern Gothic, if you follow me. But they're all referring to Gothic, which is Western, which is coming from Europe. And other communities, they restored their churches with enthusiasm. We have seen some examples, but little competence and no governmental help. And that is not good for heritage. And so in some other provinces, in Hebei and Shanxi, for example, Christian communities, they feed their own identity and reinterpret the past by remembering the martyrs, especially the martyrs of the Boxer uprising and other anti-foreign movements. So because that is their local identity of specific villages that had been destroyed with many dead people in 1900, and still today the descendants of these people, they think or they find that is the specificity of that place, so that is their own identity, and they commemorate that by building new churches, big churches, or also organizing pilgrimages. And when the Pope makes some of these martyrs saints, that's even better. Because, in fact, when the Pope canonized someone, it is exactly the same as when, sorry if I shock people, it's the same as when a government decides to list a building. You canonize something. A listed building is a canonized building. It will receive money from the state, and tourists will come and do pilgrimages to visit these places. It is a similar pattern. And when both go together, Well, it is even better. Father Hai, you are visiting Europe and you are visiting such places. When you go to Chartres, you know that there are people going to Chartres as pilgrims and others as tourists. And some as pilgrims and tourists. Perhaps you are a little bit both. I'm both. But because it's the same. It's the same. So same motivation. And it's also the idea of getting a universal value and being of public interest, and also receiving money from the state to maintain it. So this is happening too in some places in China, but not totally on the same way. So today, in China, buildings could be graded or listed at different levels. And the top level is the national level. And at national level, you only have 40 Christian churches, churches and Christian buildings, including churches that are listed as national heritage, and only 20 are Catholic churches. So you see, it's not a lot. And of these 20s, well, most are big cathedrals. You don't have rural churches or small churches. Most are big cathedrals. And you see, the very first church becoming a national monument in China is in 1988. That's a long time ago. It's the Wanghailou Church in Tianjin. And that is the church of the Tianjin massacre from 1870. So you see how a building in 1870 was crystallizing all the hate, all the anti-foreign hate, and was destroyed, and these nuns were massacred, etc. Today, that building, the same building, has a completely different meaning, has become heritage, and has become a national heritage. So that is at the highest level. So that is a huge shift. It's the same from the Cathedral of Guangzhou, 1996, the Sacred Heart Cathedral of Guangzhou, that was really a hated symbol of Christianity, anti-feng shui in Guangzhou, and how in 1996 it becomes, that's a decision from Beijing, it becomes national heritage. That shows you concretely that evolution of that heritagization process, the changing of status. And today, well, in these buildings, you have tourists going there, not only worshippers. These buildings, well, they are open to everybody. But you also have some churches belonging to building complexes. We will see some example. And then there is one church in China that is listed not because it's a church, but because it is a national cultural preservation site of the Chinese Revolution. That is this church here in Xiao Argao in no, it's Shanxi. It's Shanxi province. And so Chairman Mao held many talks in that church that was transformed into a hall. So this is also use and reuse, and these different layers of meaning that enrich the history of a place, because this is a place of memory. It could be a place of memory of the Italian Franciscans who built this, or Spanish Franciscans, sorry, who built this church, or of Chairman Mao, or tomorrow of someone else or somebody else. That is history and time. Every generation rebuilds or rewrites, or could rewrite its heritage or develop new narratives around it. I find this is a very interesting case. Because buildings are listed, there is also national or official funding for restoring them. So when buildings are listed at the top level, at national level, well, they are well restored. They are expected to be well restored, and the restoration is controlled by the State Administration for Cultural Heritage, the Bureau of Beijing. So this is done by the most competent people in China. But when buildings are only listed at provincial level or at a local level, that could be a municipality or at county level, well, there you don't have that competent people. So the big issue today, and that is my concern, is that many buildings that should have the top level, they don't have reached that level Because nobody knows their value. There is no knowledge, or not enough knowledge, that can define the value of these buildings. And with a lack of value assessment, you cannot protect them correctly. And because they are not protected correctly, they will not be renovated correctly. And their value will also diminish. So this is a kind of a diabolic construction where knowledge is a central point. Knowledge is a central point. And we will come back to this. So this is a case, this is in Tianjin, a church built by the French, Saint-Louis. This church was a ruin 3 years ago, and now the municipality decided to rebuild it. But they did not restore it. They just destroyed the whole church and they rebuilt it. So they just kept some parts of the walls, but there was a complete timber structure. They moved it. So with students were measured the beams that were laying on the ground, and we recorded the inscriptions and the numberings and the marks on these beams. We did it between 12 and 1 when the workers were sleeping. That was very... because of course it's not allowed. And this is inside, so they are rebuilding it. Now it's finished, and they rebuilt the whole church in 6 months. So they had done no research, no building archaeology, no value assessment of the elements. So it's much easier to decide I rebuild the same, or what I think is the same, but they lost all the original material, and perhaps they lost a lot of things that they just didn't know. And that's a question of competence, but also of corruption, because it's much easier to rebuild something fast with one company than doing research and taking years in order to do a restoration which is respectful of all the elements from the past. But anyway, you can see it also as something very positive, because they have renovated the church, and the church is still there at its place. It's more or less the same shape, and there are still authentic parts. So it's not black and white, but I always say it's good, but it could be better. And so I think that's a correct appreciation of such situations, because there is goodwill and there is also money. And sometimes, well, you have churches like here that would become World Heritage. This is in Guangzhou in Xiamen. So this is on the tentative list, and it will become soon a World Heritage. Well, on this island, you have churches of the different religious communities. This is the Catholic one, and well, you have other Protestant churches. I think it's a Union Church and a Methodist Church. They're very, very interesting buildings. And here they're all together, and they are expressing the past history of, well, the community. That's very diverse and interesting microcosmos on that island, and also of living communities today. So these churches are not only used as background for photographers, wedding photographers, of course, but they're also used for worship. So even at World Heritage level. And this process is still ongoing and improving. So this is the Xujiahui in Shanghai, which is perhaps one of the most important churches in China. In its size, it was the largest church, I think, in China. It's considered as being the largest one. And it is also a place very important for its history, because it's there that the first Catholic Synod took place in 1924. And you recognize, of course, Archbishop Costantini in the middle of the picture, if I believe me. And all these Vicar Apostolics of China. It's the first time in history that they came together, 1924. During the Cultural Revolution, well, the church was the towers were topped down. They were topped, so no spires. And then after, in the 1980s, the spires, they were reconstructed, and the cathedral reused. But now the cathedral is under restoration. Tomorrow afternoon I'm going to Shanghai, because Friday I'm invited the whole day by the heritage authorities of that district to help them. Not as a paid expert, but just I will learn a lot, but I will help them too about techniques and building techniques they don't know. Or they have a lot of material questions, and they want to do it well, and they really want to have that knowledge. And this is the dynamics that I found very, very positive, because I learn a lot, and I can share also my little knowledge about this architecture with professionals. when I can do that with professionals or with students, that is the best way to develop a new generation that would do it better than the present one. So here again, you remember that church, the Anglican Holy Trinity Church in Shanghai, that had been divided into floors. Well, it had been restored in 1996. There you see people with these big saws. They were really destroying the floor. And this church has been renovated and restored, and is really has, well, found its authenticity and its beautiful interior again. So this is also a nice example of restoration, a well-done restoration. Not always the case. There's another one that burned. Often churches are burning because that's a way you can renovate them violently. So, well, this is universal. This is not only in China. This happens everywhere, including in my country. And so then when it's burned, well, you have to do something, and there is no more discussions about shall I do it or not do it. You must do it. So that is a good method. And you see, well, sometimes you redesign things. Compare here how this church was before the fire and how it is today. So it has been redesigned. This is not really the best restoration, and in fact it has been completely rebuilt, as you can see. But it's still evoking something on the same place and in the public space. This is the one of Guangzhou that had been also restored with a lot of money. Recently, in 2008, I think, as a kind of compensation of the Olympics in Beijing, then all the cities received money. And here they put the money in one of the most important monuments of Guangzhou. And there they built a concrete roof. So the wooden roof had been, well, was attacked by insects. And it's a very, very big investment. But of course, it's a pity that the original roof structure was lost. But now this church has been this very important church has been renovated, well renovated, because it is a national monument. And in many cathedrals also and churches, well, new stained glass windows are placed. That is a very important element of a church, the sacred light coming through the windows. And so this is one of these workshops that are selling producing stained glass windows. So there are big discussions about the iconographic representations or not. So you see the Xujiahui Cathedral in Shanghai. The last bishop, he started to put stained glass windows that are designed by, I think, a Chinese designer, but they are abstract. They're abstract. And half of these windows have been done. Now the bishop, there is no more the bishop, and people are waiting the new one, and they say, everybody hopes that he will stop and do something new that is not abstract, but it's figurative. So you see there are big debates also about stained glass windows, about furniture, about decoration, because the people, it's important for them. And it is creating new heritage in the context of heritage. And these are these bottom-up movements where the users, the people are using it. And so I come to the last point. I'm in time, I think. I'm in time. Yeah. And this is about development of knowledge and how new knowledge can help to change the perception of heritage. And a recent different approach considers the historic churches as a result from the encounter of Chinese and Western building traditions. That is what I explained in the very, very beginning of this talk. So encounter, it's a result of the encounter. And missionaries are no more considered only as people who come to evangelize, but as, this is a formulation of my own, as agents of technological transfer. When you want to develop a research project in China, it's much better to use that for missionaries than telling that they came for evangelize. Because that idea of technological transfer is something dynamic and positive. And evangelizing is positive too, but not for everybody. But technological transfer is considered as something very positive. And it's fascinating Chinese today, because technology and high tech is fascinating people. That's part of progress. And how this long, long tradition suddenly changed because someone came from another side of the world with other ideas, other techniques. How, Chinese, they used bricks. And suddenly someone is coming and say, I use bricks too, but otherwise. So, and so that's the origin of a discussion, of a debate. I'm interested to learn from you. And so they created things together. So these missionaries as agents of technological transfers, this is true especially in rural areas. You understood why too. And this approach fits in a broader international narrative, which is new, and which is called shared built heritage. So this is built heritage, this is not intangible, or there are intangible aspects, but this is, in first instance, built heritage. And this is shared built heritage. So it is in China, it belongs to China, no discussion about that. But the origin and the story of these buildings, they're not 100% Chinese. They are the result of that encounter, that missionary encounter. So also understanding these buildings could only be done together. To understand it better and also to develop a new narrative, new histories that really are going to the real story of these buildings, not to invented stories, because there are a lot of invented stories around churches. You know that you have some dragons that are underground and that are positive or negative. You have a lot of stories which are very interesting because they're expressing something of local communities. But there are also the facts and how things were constructed by who and why and all the questions we have risen earliest. So the question is, could new stories told by buildings from the past uses and occupation, even on controversial sites, could them exceed, without S, exceed religion issues and contribute